Hi everyone, Dr. Dave Richardson. I'm your instructor for today's webinar. Today's webinar is actually going to be a very focused webinar on a demonstration of the Smq Analysis Tool. The basis of this webinar is that over the last couple years when we were doing face-to-face training, we would ask our attendees about their use of particular tools that the MSSO provided for MedDRA users, and many times we're told that people were not aware of these tools or how to use them. So today's webinar is going to focus on the Smq Analysis Tool, which is embedded in two other versions of the MedDRA browser. Now, a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I'm going to be assisted today by Hannah Eden, who is the training coordinator for the MSSO. You have available to you a chat box in which you can type questions, and at the end of the webinar, I will answer the questions that you have presented. I will also point out that we are going to firmly focus on the tool today. So if there are general questions about SMQs or basic questions, and it is clear that a particular attendee might benefit by taking the SMQ analysis, or excuse me, the SMQ webinar, I'll point that out as well. The webinar is scheduled for an hour. Done this one a couple times. I think we'll probably be done with presenting the material in about 40 minutes time, which will leave adequate time for questions and answers. The other thing is we're going to have poll EV available. It's a nice to have, but not crucial for you to use today. I'm just going to ask some questions of the group to see what kind of familiarity you have with the various types of SMQs that exist. Now, the next part is the most important thing. I'm looking at the screen and it is telling me that I have about 41 different connections for this webinar. If you attended the SMQ webinar that I gave last Wednesday, I repeat, if you attended the SMQ webinar that I gave last Wednesday, you probably do not want to attend today's webinar. It is going to be nothing more than a presentation of the tool demonstration, which is something that I showed you last week. So I just want to create fair expectations. This is not a comprehensive discussion of SMQs. It's going to focus on the analysis tool. And if you attended last week's webinar on SMQs, the tool demonstration was part of that presentation, so there'll be no additional or new information provided. Okay, so that's all the housekeeping things that I want to talk about, and let's get going with today's webinar. So again, I'm Dr. David Richardson. I'm your instructor for today. I am a neurologist by training and a medical officer with the MedDRA MSSO. I've been with the MSSO about 8 years as a consultant, and I am physically based on the East Coast of the United States in Annapolis, Maryland. This is to remind me to inform you that MedDRA is owned by ICH, and because it is a living and breathing terminology that requires maintenance, the ICH MedDRA Management Committee created an organization, the ICH created an organization called the MedDRA Maintenance and Support Services Organization, or MSSO. The activities of the MSSO are overseen by an ICH MedDRA Management Committee, which is made up of ICH parties, MHRA, Health Canada, and the World Health Organization as an observer. First bullet here is to remind me to tell you that today's material is copyrighted and ICH owns the copyright. However, with the exception of the MedDRA and ICH logo, you can feel free to present this material in public presentations as long as you acknowledge that ICH owns the copyright. However, if you change the presentation in any way, shape, or form, you should not imply or infer that ICH endorses the changes or supports the changes that you've made. The second bullet is legal language. I will read it verbatim. The presentation is provided as is without warranty of any kind. In no event shall the ICH or the authors of the original presentation be liable for any claim, damages, or other liability arising from the use of the presentation. And I don't believe we have any third-party slides today. If we do have third-party slides, then we generally will tell you that in order to use those slides in a presentation, you will need to get permission of that party. I don't believe we have any, but if we come across one, I'll point out that it's a third-party slide that will require explicit permission from whoever provided us that slide in order for you to use it in any presentation. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to focus on today. We're going to just very quickly review the key features of SMQs for those of you who may need a quick refresher, but certainly not in any comprehensive way. We're going to identify also some other SMQ resources that are available to you that are often overlooked by MedDRA users, but the real focus of today's presentation is going to be how you access and use the Smq Analysis Tool. I'll then say a little bit about practical applications of SMQs, and then we'll conclude with questions and answers. All right, so in order to use the poll EV function, you have a couple ways of accessing it. You can either go into a browser on your computer or cell phone, type in pollev.com, where it asks for the username. You're going to type in MedDRA, MEDDRA 174 as the username and click join. And then you can skip over the next screen and be able to respond to the activity. The other way is to use a QR code, and I'm just going to put the QR code for Poll Everywhere up and just give you 15 seconds or so to scan that if that's the way that you would prefer to access Poll EV. So let me give you about 15 seconds to be able to pull that up, and then we'll get going with today's material. All right, give you about 5 more seconds. Okay, quick review of SMQs. As we talked about in the SMQ webinar, SMQs are groupings of terms for one or more MedDRA SOCs or system organ classes that are related to a medical condition or area of interest. It is a specialized query that is designed to be able to go into a database of MedDRA coded data and be able to identify potential cases of a topic of interest. So as we said before, the terms in any query can be related to a wide range of things, including diagnoses and disorders, signs and symptoms, syndromes, physical findings, laboratory results, imaging studies, results of those studies, and other things, including such things as therapies for a particular condition of interest, or maybe even some of the social circumstances around a person who has a particular medical condition. But the key thing about SMQs is that they are intended, like with any query, to aid you in identifying a case of interest. So this is a slide we saw last time where you take coded data, whether it's in a database from a clinical trial or a safety database, you create a query, which in this case, we've created the query of SMQs, which contains PTs and LLTs that are subordinate to those PTs, which are felt to be representative of concepts that might be characteristic of the condition of interest. You put them into a query tool and run it against the data set and look for hits where an LLT in the query matches an LLT in the database. And today we're going to actually show you how we've created a tool for you that is a query tool called the Smq Analysis Tool. I show this one just to remind you as well that we have, as of version 25.0, which was released in March, 110 level 1 SMQs, all of which are topics related to very serious clinical conditions. So things from COVID to convulsions to anaphylactic reaction to shock. These are all concepts that if you were not aware that you might have a potential association with one of these things in your database of coded data, you probably do want to be aware of that potential association, because these are the kinds of disorders, agranulocytosis, osteonecrosis, that could potentially stop you from being able to get marketing authorization for a product or make it difficult to keep a product on the market, depending upon the risk-benefit analysis for that particular product. Okay. Very quickly, we're going to talk a little bit about these topics related to SMQs just as a review as well. We said that all the terms in SMQs are constructed at the PT level, so we have the PTs and subordinate LLTs. So we see, as we know with MedDRA, as you go down to 5 levels of MedDRA, we get more granularity, more specificity, and when we start talking about SMQs, we're talking about 25,000 preferred terms and about 85,000 LLTs that could potentially be in any one of the SMQs. Now, this was a very, very important topic that we covered in SMQs, which is the whole idea that we present you with SMQs, some of which have narrow terms, some of which have broad terms, in addition to the narrow terms. And when you use an SMQ, what terms you tend or desire to use are going to be a reflection of what it is that you're trying to pull out of your database. So we talked about this before. This is worth emphasizing again, because in order to use the tool, the Smq Analysis Tool, you need to fine-tune this sometimes in terms of whether you're going to do a narrow or broad search. So in general, SMQs contain terms that are usually narrow in scope, and most of them also have terms that are broad in scope. When we talk about narrow scope terms, we're talking about highly specific terms that are very likely to identify the condition of interest, whereas when we talk about broad search terms, we're talking about maximizing sensitivity. So when you do a narrow search, you're only using the narrow terms within an SMQ. But if you decide to maximize sensitivity, then you would employ a broad search strategy, which would be a combination of narrow and broad search terms. Now, I went through this example last week, but I'll just point it out to you. Why do we care about specificity and sensitivity? It all depends upon what you want to pull out of the database. I gave the hypothetical that you have a new job now where you're in charge of security for a major soccer club, the Pegasus Football Club. And one of the things that you're concerned about is that whenever your fans get together in the stadium with fans from another team, there's always the potential for a bad outcome where people let their emotions get the best of them. And your job is to try to minimize these bad outcomes. So you analyzed this and you came to the conclusion that one of the major contributors to these bad outcomes is when people are allowed to bring alcoholic beverages into the stands, because it then creates a problem where their judgment may be impaired. Well, you have now the ability to create a mechanism to try to keep fans safe. The question is, how do you want to do this? You have screening devices at all the gates of your stadium where you can design them so that they either maximize specificity or sensitivity. Let me show you what I mean by that. Suppose you have concluded that the real culprit with these kinds of fights that break out into the stands is that people come in with aluminum cans, which are 12 ounces in capacity, which have an alcoholic beverage in it called beer, and that the can will say B-E-E-R. So you've decided to build a machine that is very specific. It will screen someone, and if they have any of these aluminum cylinders with 12 ounces of liquid in it that have the word B-E-E-R on them, then it will say, stop that person and search them because they're trying to bring beer in. It's a very specific solution, but it may not be a complete solution, because suppose someone has beverage cans that are 11 ounces or 16 ounces, or suppose the word beer is not spelled in American English, B-E-E-R, but spelled B-I-E-R, for instance, in another language. Then your highly specific solution may be amiss. On the other hand, then you could adopt a strategy of trying to maximize sensitivity, in which case you would program your device to detect the presence of any kind of liquid on an individual and use that as your screening device. But the problem with sensitivity, high sensitivity, is that it casts a much broader net, and you'll be stopping people that have bottles of baby formula, or maybe cans of soda, or that guy who has a can of motor oil in his back pocket, or the person who has a flask that has something in it. Now, it may be that flask contains an alcoholic beverage, but the whole point here is that by maximizing sensitivity, you are going to be looking at a lot more individuals. And it's the same thing when you are using the SMQs. The SMQs can be used for a very specific search, or if you maximize sensitivity by using broad search terms in addition to narrow search terms, then you in fact could end up having to screen and evaluate cases that are not of particular interest to you. So let's talk about where this actually works in a real live practical SMQ. Here's the SMQ for lactic acidosis. You can see that this one is a combination of narrow and broad search terms. The narrow terms in this SMQ are actually only 3 terms: blood lactic acid increase, hyperlactidemia, and lactic acidosis. Those terms are so specific that if you find one of those concepts in your case, it's very likely to be a case of lactic acidosis. However, this SMQ also contains broad search terms. And if you were to do a broad search strategy, you would be using the narrow and broad terms and potentially would pull cases of, let's say, metabolic acidosis, where you'd have to look at the case and see whether the acid involved was lactic acid or some other acid. Because again, you've gone with a broad search strategy which maximizes sensitivity. So here's my first poll EV question to you. We have 110 level 1 SMQs. Do you know how many SMQs contain only narrow search terms? So I'll give you a few seconds to type in your response. How many of the 110 SMQs contain only narrow search terms? One response saying no, 35, 25. So the response gets larger, as many of you know, with the more people that select that particular response. So we've got everything from 2 to 100 up here on the screen. Don't want to belabor the point. So of the 110 level 1 SMQs available to you, 33, I repeat, 33 of them contain only narrow search terms. And therefore, those particular SMQs are designed to be very specific in terms of the kind of cases that they would pull. Now, that then stands to also reason that the majority of SMQs contain narrow and broad terms. But I will point out one thing as well. There are no, I repeat, no SMQs that contain only broad terms. So you can have narrow and broad, but there are no SMQs that have broad terms only. Now, there are two other subtypes of SMQs in that group of 110 that I want to talk about. There are so-called algorithmic SMQs, which are designed to use algorithms, because we've found that when it comes to the broad search strategy, the best way sometimes of identifying cases is by a defined combination of selected terms. So what do we mean by that? Well, here's an actual algorithmic SMQ in MedDRA for anaphylactic reaction. It contains narrow search terms as well as broad search terms. Now, in order for this particular algorithm to suggest that you should look at a case, one of two things needs to be the case. When we look at the narrow search terms, if any one of these concepts is represented in the case, you're going to be instructed to look at that case. So one way this algorithm works is if we have a concept from the category A or narrow search terms, it will be a case that you should look at. Well, we're interested in anaphylactic reaction, so it shouldn't surprise you. These are specific terms like anaphylactic shock or anaphylactoid shock or circulatory collapse. Those are very, very specific concepts which are very likely to be a potential case of anaphylactic reaction. On the other hand, the algorithm really applies when we start talking about the broad search terms. And for this particular SMQ, there are three categories of broad search terms: Category B, Category C, Category D. The Category B terms are going to be terms related to the upper airway and respiratory system. So we're showing you three of them here. This is not the entire list of broad search terms that are Category B in this SMQ, but here are three of them: acute respiratory failure, asthma, bronchial edema. We also have Category C terms, which relate to angioedema, urticaria, mucosal problems, such as allergic edema, angioedema, erythema. And then there's a third category, which are Category D, which are cardiovascular or hypotension in nature. So we have things like blood pressure decrease, blood pressure diastolic decrease, blood pressure systolic decrease. And in terms of these broad search terms, you will be told to look at a case by this algorithm if it has a concept from Category B and a concept from Category C. So it could be acute respiratory failure and erythema, or it could be bronchial edema and angioedema. The other way that this particular SMQ would tell you to look at a case is if you have a concept from either category B or a concept from category C and a concept for category D. So if you had, for instance, blood pressure diastolic decreased and erythema, or blood pressure diastolic decreased and asthma. So that's how this particular algorithmic SMQ works. You either have something in category A, B and C, B or C and D. And each one of the algorithmic SMQs has its own unique algorithm that if you consult the browser will tell you how to use that particular, or what the algorithm is for that particular SMQ. So this is just a graphical display of the same concept. So now here's my question to you a second time. How many SMQs are algorithmic? We have 110 SMQs. How many of them are algorithmic? So again, a wide range, as few as 3, and now we have people saying as many as 80. The correct answer is 10. 10 of the SMQs, level 1 SMQs, are algorithmic in nature. And in fact, each one has its own unique algorithm. So if you're thinking about using one of those SMQs, then you need to consult a reference such as the SMQ Introductory Guide to explain to you what the algorithm is for that SMQ. Now, there's another subtype of SMQ, which are so-called hierarchical, which are based on a hierarchy. This is not the standard MedDRA hierarchy of 5 levels, but actually the use of SMQs and subordinate sub-SMQs, which can be used in terms to maximize your ability to select a case of interest. So here's an example. We have an SMQ which is hierarchical in nature called hematopoietic cytopenias, meaning a relative deficiency of some line of blood cell in the bone marrow. Now, that's the level 1 SMQ, but at the level 2, we see there are 4 sub-SMQs underneath that. One for cytopenias involving more than one type of blood cell. This one for erythropenias relates to red blood cells. This one relates to white blood cells, leukopenia, and this one relates through platelets or thrombocytopenia. Now, we can see that if we were interested in identifying cases in our database which were associated with low platelet counts, that if we run the level 1 SMQ, we're going to end up pulling a lot of cases that we weren't interested in. And maybe in that circumstance, the smarter thing for us to do would have been to use only the level 2 hierarchy, or the level 2 sub-SMQ specifically related to PTs and LLT around the concept of thrombocytopenia. So that's a second subtype of SMQ. So my question to you now is, how many of the SMQs are hierarchical? And you've already started weighing in, and I've got everything from 5 to 110 so far. Give you a few more minutes. Correct answer is 25. So let's just review. We said that 10 of the SMQs are algorithmic, 25 are hierarchical, and 33 of them contain only narrow search terms. So SMQs also have a status. An SMQ is either active or inactive. There's only one SMQ ever made inactive, and that was the one for pregnancy issues, made inactive, I believe, in 13.1, version 13.1. And it was made inactive because a newer SMQ was released, which incorporated not only pregnancy issues, but neonatal issues as well. So this is similar to the concept of currency in MedDRA at the LLT level. However, once a term is put into an SMQ, even though its status may change from active to inactive, it is never taken out of the SMQ itself. So here's an example where in the SMQ for acute central respiratory depression, we see that this particular PT, acute respiratory distress syndrome, was made inactive in that particular SMQ. And you can tell that by the fact that there's a red box around PT if you look at this in the browser. Now, MedDRA versioning is important as well, because when you use SMQs, you should always be using an SMQ version which matches the version of MedDRA that was used to code the data. In other words, you do not want to use an SMQ from version 25.0 with data that was coded with 23.0, because the mismatch in version that was used can lead to incorrect or incomplete information. So you want a good match by making sure the same versions are used. So relative benefits and limitations of SMQs: their benefits, they're applicable across multiple therapeutic areas, they're validated, reusable search logic. If we are talking about the same version of MedDRA in the same release, the communication about this SMQ would be standardized. It doesn't matter what language we're talking about, the terms in that SMQ would be the same in English or any of the other languages in which MedDRA is available. Also, there's an element of consistency that if you run the same SMQ against the same data set repeatedly, you're always going to get the same results. And the best thing for you is that these SMQs are maintained by the MSSO and the Japanese Maintenance Organization, which is our companion organization which maintains the Japanese language version of MedDRA. So those are benefits. Limitations: well, we don't have an SMQ for every possible topic, and even when we have one in place, it needs to be constantly tweaked and sometimes modified as either our understanding of the utility of that SMQ or maybe the condition of interest may evolve over time, so that terms may need to be added or perhaps made inactive or somehow modified within an SMQ. So it's all a balancing act. Other resources that I just want to mention very quickly, just summarizing them right here, and at the end I'll open them up and just show you what they look like. The first is the Smq Intro guide, which comes with every release of MedDRA. This is an encyclopedic 300-page document which has everything you would ever want to know about an SMQ. And so before you use any SMQs, I would heartily suggest that you at least read the 4 or 5 pages on your particular SMQ to make sure it's going to do what you want it to do. The second thing you get in each release is a so-called version report, which is derived using the MedDRA Version Analysis Tool, or MVAT as we call it. And this is a screen that allows you to see what changes have occurred from one version of MedDRA to the next. And we see in this particular version report, 108 SMQ changes have occurred. And if we were to scroll here on the bottom and click on the tab for SMQ changes, we would be able to see on a spreadsheet page a summary of the SMQ changes. And then with each release, we also have something called the Smq Spreadsheet, which is a comprehensive summary of SMQs, as well as the component PTs and LLTs that are within those SMQs. So 3 sources or resources available to you with each release. And again, after we're done, I will just open those up and just show you what they look like. So again, SMQ guide, spreadsheet, version report. Okay, so now today's focus is really going to be on this MedDRA analysis tool, Smq Analysis Tool in the MedDRA browser. As you know, we have 3 versions of the browser available to you: a desktop browser, a web-based browser, and a mobile browser that you can bring up on a tablet or cell phone. Now, for these 2 versions, desktop and web-based browser, this Smq Analysis Tool is embedded into these particular browsers for you to use. These 2 versions of the browser have a number of different features, but the one that we really want to concentrate on today is the ability to upload terms to run against an SMQ list as is provided in the Smq Analysis Tool. So when we run SMQs, what are we doing? From an IT or information technology perspective, an SMQ is nothing more than a stored query. Most of you code and store your data as LLTs. The Smq files that we provide you with each release contain PTs with their subordinate LLTs. And what you do is to load SMQs into a query tool. You run that against MedDRA coded data and you look for hits. We're going to show you how the Smq Analysis Tool works, because in fact, it's our gift to you as a usable query tool. But also remember, in figuring out what aspects of a particular SMQ to use, you need to make decisions about whether you're interested in a narrow search, a broad search, whether you might be better served by using an algorithmic SMQ or a hierarchical SMQ. So let's talk about why we would use this tool and how we would use it. So let's say you are in a pharmaceutical company that is collecting data from trials or from post-marketing, and you're coding it into your database using MedDRA, and you're putting a bunch of terms in there, be it PTs with the subordinate LLTs, or however you're coding, you might be just coding LLTs into your database. At some point, you might be very interested in trying to run your data set against the existing 110 SMQs to see if you have any cases of any of those topics hiding in your database that you may not have been aware of. You're going to need help doing this. So you're going to have to go into your toolbox of MedDRA tools and use the Smq Analysis Tool. So here's what I want you to just understand. The first thing I'm going to do is show you a spreadsheet. And here is a spreadsheet of data. And for purposes of this illustration, this is the data of my database. This is everything in my database. Granted, it's not much. I didn't want this to be hundreds of rows of data. I want this to be manageable. But as you can see, this is data that I have collected related to 17 patients. So I have a patient 1 has a couple of adverse events, patient 2 has a couple, patient 3 has only 1. I've done that now with 17 different patients. And I put MedDRA terms into this database, and we see those terms here. And in this column, we see the MedDRA code that is assigned, the numerical code for each one of those particular MedDRA terms. So that's the first thing that I wanted you to see in setting up this demonstration. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the MedDRA browser, and I'm going to use the desktop browser for today's demonstration, just in case, well, I always use a desktop browser because when I am doing face-to-face presentations, should we have any problems with the internet connection, I still want to be able to have access to the browser to show it to an audience. So now I've opened this thing up, and I've opened it in the SOC view, but you also know that I have the luxury of being able to switch to the SMQ view, which instead of showing me the 27 SOCs, is showing me the 110 level 1 SMQs. And also understand that if I were to open up any one of these SMQs, it's going to show me the PTs that are part of that SMQ. In this case, we looked in acute pancreatitis. We see a combination of blue PTs, which are narrow in scope. We see the red ones, which are broad in scope. This particular SMQ is algorithmic, which is why we have category B and category C, for instance. And then we have other SMQs as well that I would just want you to familiarize yourself with. But that's not really what we're focusing on today. This is what we did when we did the SMQ webinar. I'm focusing now on this one right here, this tab for the Smq Analysis Tool. And I'm going to open up that tool, and this is what I'm going to get. It opens up the tool for me. And when I open the tool, the default is that it is, for me, in English in version 25.0. If I were to scroll through the screen, it is showing me all 110 of the level 1 SMQs with a few subtleties. For instance, we see angioedema and arthritis and asthma bronchospasm, but here's one for biliary disorders, which has a plus sign. When I see a plus sign, if I click on that plus sign, it's telling me that this is a hierarchical SMQ. And now it's showing me the level 2 SMQs, which is biliary neoplasms, and this one functional inflammatory and gallstone-related biliary disorders. And if I were to click on these, you're going to see level 3s appear. And this will go on for however many levels there are in a particular SMQ. So for this one, I'm already seeing that there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of SMQs in that particular hierarchical SMQ. And then we have other ones where we have instructions behind the name of the SMQ, like this one here for eosinophilic pneumonia. These are algorithmic SMQs, and these are a description of a particular algorithm and how they work. So that's just one thing that you would be able to identify in looking at the sheet, that you have the ability to see the entire hierarchy of 110 SMQs, as well as the subordinate sub-SMQs and hierarchical, as well as identifying which ones are algorithmic. So I'm going to clear all of that and go back to my original 110. Now, let's look at what we have when we open this thing up. I have some options of how I do a search. The default is narrow search, which means it's only going to run narrow search terms when I input data. But I also have the option of doing a broad search, which would include not only narrow terms, but broad terms as well if it was an SMQ that was a combination of narrow and broad terms. And then the third option is to look at or do a search specifically focused on those 10 algorithmic SMQs. So here's what I'm going to want to do. I told you that I had this small pharmaceutical company with a limited amount of data that I put into that Excel spreadsheet that I showed you. And I'm interested in running the existing SMQs to see if I have any problems that I'm not aware of. So I'm going to start out by saying, let me do a broad search. I'm going to maximize sensitivity here by including narrow and broad terms. So I'm going to say, let's do a broad search. And the first thing it's going to do is bring up this instruction sheet. And this instruction sheet is telling you how do you create an Excel spreadsheet properly formatted so that the tool will work. So you can see that it requires 4 rows of data, one of which is an ID, which is optional. So you saw that I had an ID row with 17 patients identified. The term itself, the code, the case ID, all of these things would be necessary in creating one of these kinds of spreadsheets. And this is where you go to understand how to set up a spreadsheet. You'll also see that the maximum number of records is 100,000. So that's the limitation in terms of number of rows. But I'm going to take my properly formatted Excel spreadsheet that I created for my data on that 17 patient database that I showed you. So what I'm going to do is browse now because it's going to ask me to import data. And I'm going to need to import my data. So I'm going to search and find that spreadsheet, which is right here. I've saved it on my hard drive. And I'm going to put it in the tool. And now I'm going to run the tool. And it's going to run the tool. And here's what it does. The Smq Analysis Tool has done its work. What is it telling me? It's done an Smq analysis on this date at this time. It did it in English, version 25.0, and I asked for a broad search strategy. Well, let's see what it is doing for me here. Here it has a summary of data. So what you see here are all of the terms that were in my database being represented. Now, please note that some of the terms appear more than once. So we have amylase abnormal appearing only one time, but abdominal distension appears at least twice. Here's acute kidney injury appearing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, multiple times, as is the same for blood creatinine increase, status asthmaticus, which is repeated status with asthma. And a number of other terms are repeated more than once, swelling face, etc. Well, why is that the case? Well, in order to understand that, we need to scroll over and see exactly what is it that we're looking at. So here is the term. In this particular case, I loaded my spreadsheet with PT. So by definition, the LLT associated with them is going to be the PT itself. But if I start scrolling across, here's what I see. It is showing me what is the SMQ that's being matched in that this concept appears in a particular SMQ. So in this particular case, we see that amylase abnormal was in the SMQ acute pancreatitis. Whereas for abdominal distension, that particular concept is in 2 different SMQs, acute pancreatitis, as well as this one for gastrointestinal nonspecific symptoms and therapeutic procedures. Now, if I look further, it's telling me the scope of those terms. So in this particular SMQ, that term is broad in scope. In this particular SMQ, it's broad in scope. Whereas for this SMQ, it's narrow in scope. For algorithmic SMQ, for hierarchical SMQs, it's telling me what category it is, whether it's category A, which are narrow terms, or B, or C, or D, however many categories there are. The weight here is for weighted algorithms. I did not touch on that. That is one specific SMQ, which is the SMQ for lupus erythematosus. Now, that particular SMQ is extremely, extremely unique. And let me explain to you what is extremely unique about it. I'm going to go back and show you this SMQ. And what I want to point out about this SMQ is that when I open it up, it is telling me that it is a combination of narrow terms, which are very specific for lupus, like lupus enteritis or lupus hepatitis, but it also has a bunch of categories under the broad search terms, category B, C, D, E, all the way down to category I. Well, the category I terms are serologic in nature. The ones that are in H relate to blood counts like leukopenia or thrombocytopenia. The G's are related to epilepsy and seizures. If I scroll further up, the E's are related to things affecting the pericardium, like pericarditis or pleural effusion or pleural rub. If I go up to the B's, these are dermatologic. So each one of those categories focuses on a particular kind of clinical problem. And the way this algorithm works is that each one of these terms in the broad search strategy are given a weight. So if I were to select butterfly rash and ask to see its characteristics, it tells me that within that SMQ, it has a weight of 1. So if a patient had a butterfly rash, they would have a weight of 1 assigned to their case. If they also had a pleural effusion, that would have a weight of 3. So now 3 plus 1 is 4. If they had IgM nephropathy, that would be a weight of 1. So now they're up to 5. And if that patient also had epilepsy, that would be a weight of 2. And now that adds up to 7. And the way this algorithmic weighted SMQ works is once the sum is 7 or greater, that is a potential case that you need to evaluate because it could be a case of lupus. So having said that now, I'm going to go back to where I was with the tool. And so again, Smq Analysis Tool, broad search, asked for my data, I put my data in, I run it, I get my spreadsheet. So now I'm going to scroll over and I'm going to see in this broad search that I did, what else can I glean? I can glean that the weighted algorithm here is 0 for everything besides those cases that may be related to lupus. Here's the status, they're all active, but we also see one other thing here as well, which is some of these are normal SMQs, which have just the level 1 SMQ with maybe a combination of narrow and broad terms or only narrow terms. But some of these concepts are in hierarchical SMQs. And if I scroll over, I can see that some of these concepts appear in SMQs that have as many as 4 levels. So this particular SMQ term here for supraventricular tachyarrhythmias was hierarchical and found in the level 4 sub-SMQ. So this is telling me that I have a lot going on here in terms of potential cases of SMQ-related findings. Now, I just want to try to make good sense of this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the level 1 SMQs, which are listed here, just based upon output of what I had in my database. But what I'm going to do is do a little manipulation of this data here and actually ask it to resort it. But this time what I'm going to ask it to do is to display it alphabetically. The first thing it's going to ask me is, do you want to also sort out the columns around it? And I'll say yes. And look what's happened now. It is telling me that when I look at the entirety of data and what SMQ is being matched at level 1, that I have a bunch of cases potentially related to acute pancreatitis, a bunch of cases related to anaphylactic reaction, a bunch of cases potentially related to drug reaction with eosinophilia and systemic symptoms, or DRESS syndrome as it's called. I have a bunch of cases with hypersensitivity potentially associated. So one thing I'm starting to glean is, if I didn't know that my drug might have some association with anaphylaxis and other types of concepts like shock, I probably need to know that because it potentially leads to instructions in my labeling. So that is how one would use the broad search strategy. On the other hand, let's look at one of the other options that we had as well in using this particular SMQ or this tool. One of the other options as well was to, and I'll go back to the tool itself, was to potentially also change the search strategy. So this time, rather than using the broad search, I'm going to use the algorithmic search. And then it's going to say we still need data, and I'm going to put the same data set in and run this a second time. So now this is an algorithmic search. And now look at what happens. I get more output. What is this telling me? It's telling me I run the data again at this particular time, and I use the algorithmic search. Now, I show you this to show you something that should be very worrisome to you. Again, we look at what was matched, and we see, again, acute pancreatitis and anaphylactic reaction, which we saw in the broad search strategy. But I want you to pay attention to right here, systemic lupus erythematosus. This is, again, one of the 10 algorithmic SMQs. But I want you to appreciate that we had a number of terms here. And when I look at the patients involved, here we have patient number 13 had one concept, SLE arthritis. That was a narrow search term. So that tells you you need to look at that case because you had a category A narrow search term. This is potentially a case of lupus. But here's what's more worrisome. Here is patient number 14. That patient has three concepts, hemolysis, autoimmune nephritis, and double-stranded DNA antibody positive. And this was the weighted algorithm where we see when I add up the weights, 3 + 1 is 4 + 3 is 7. This algorithm would tell me pull that case as well. That should scare me that in a data set with only 17 patients, 2 of them potentially have a lupus-like problem that might be related to my drug. And if I didn't know that, I want to know that sooner rather than later. So this is how the tool works. You use it to select SMQs of interest that you want to look at. You create a properly formatted data set on a spreadsheet, and you define the focus of whether you want to use algorithmic, broad, or narrow search strategy. You can select specific SMQs if you're not interested in looking at the entirety of all 110 level 1 SMQs, and you run the tool and you get your data. So that's how the tool works. Here's to summarize what we did. We went in the browser, we opened up the Smq Analysis Tool. It opened up the portal. It gave me this interactive tool here where I needed to decide what I wanted to do by selecting the type of search that I want to do and maybe even specific SMQs that I wanted to check. I created my SMQ data set, having known before what the requirements were. Here I had the terms, I had a row ID, I had a code, I had a case ID. I have all 4 levels, even though this one, the row ID, is potentially optional. I got broad search, which showed me a bunch of things that I was perhaps aware of, not aware of, what certainly the association of my product with what looked like immune-mediated or allergic type problems. And then I went on to the algorithmic where I clearly got a wake-up call if I did not know that my product might be associated with a lupus-like syndrome. So let's then conclude by talking about how do we use these things in a practical sense. Well, we can use them in clinical trials, and I suggest that we use SMQs when you are in development if you have no idea what the safety profile of your drug is. When it is not well established, you might run multiple SMQs against your data on a routine basis as a screening tool. You might also, based upon preclinical data or the fact that your drug is already in a defined class of drugs, you might run SMQs based upon what you presume to be class effect. This was a situation where with COVID-19, in relationship to developing vaccines, where we see that the SMQ for anaphylaxis was used by the Food and Drug Administration in helping with its analysis of COVID-related data. So it does get used in a practical sense in regulatory as well as in industry environments. We also could use it in the post-approval setting, where you have a product that you have marketing authorization for, where you use SMQs to retrieve cases for suspected or known safety issues. You might use it as part of your signal detection. You might use it for single case analysis. You might use it for looking for things such as lack of efficacy. We have an SMQ for lack of efficacy effect that you could tailor specifically to be able to determine if there might be an efficacy problem with your drug that needs to be reported in a periodic report. So we're going to conclude with just two quick examples of a nitty-gritty, how does this work in the real world? First scenario, you have in your company decided to develop a new drug for onychomycosis, which is going to take you 8 years to develop, and you're projecting it's going to cost $1.2 billion. What is onychomycosis? It's toenail fungus. Keep that in mind, it's toenail fungus. So as part of your safety surveillance, you decide to run a bunch of SMQs against your data, looking for serious adverse events. And in the first 1,000 patient exposures, you come up with 5, I repeat, 5 potential cases of hemolytic anemia. Given the unfavorable risk-benefit ratio, because remember, your drug is for toenail fungus, you decide to recommend to your management that you stop the development of the product. Your management reviews the situation, follows your recommendation, and curtails further development of product, saving the company time and money and potentially saving patients the risk of potentially developing hemolytic anemia from a product that was designed for a fairly innocuous condition, which was toenail fungus. So that is a job well done. How about scenario 2? You're developing the 4th drug in a therapeutic class. Other drugs in the class have been associated with the development of high blood pressure and angioedema. But given the seriousness of the target disease, let's say it's for a particular type of cancer, this is considered to be an acceptable risk. So you run routinely, not only during development, but during post-marketing, the SMQs for hypertension and angioedema against your continuously expanding safety data. And over time, it becomes clear that your drug is not associated with either of these risks that are identified in other drugs in the class. And we're talking about way down the line where you've had, say, perhaps a few million exposures to then be able to say, we don't look like we have this problem. Your diligence results in being able to offer to patients a safer alternative for the treatment of their disease, which does not potentially expose them to the development of either of these associated risks for hypertension or angioedema. Congratulations to you. So let's summarize what we talked about today. We talked about some key features of the standardized MedDRA queries. We talked about resources available to you, which included the SMQ Intro guide. We talked also about the version analysis, and we talked about the SMQ spreadsheet. And then we really focused on accessing and utilizing the SMQ Analysis Tool and talked about some real-life scenarios where you might use this tool against a data set, either in development of a product or trying to preserve a product on the market. So at this point, that's the material I wanted to cover related to the tool. And I'm going to stop at this point and ask Hannah if we have questions from the audience.
We have a couple questions. Our first one asks, mostly PTs are used to retrieve cases. What role does LLTs play in retrieving cases? Is there any advantage in including LLTs in your retrieval?
So sometimes, thank you for the question. So sometimes at the PT level, the PT concept is broad enough or non-specific enough that you may not get a full idea of what's going on with your data by just looking at the PT concepts. you may want in your analysis, particularly if you are trying to rescue a drug that's at risk for not being approved or being pulled from the market, of really looking at the LLTs associated with that PT, because that'll give you a better understanding of what's going on. Just to give you an example, at the LLT level in MedDRA, there are very often many times when we will have a specific species of bacteria mentioned. It'll say strep or staph or clostridial or some species at an LLT level, that when we get to the medical concept at the PT level, it simply says microbial as an adjective. Well, if you really were trying to get a better understanding of whether this was, bacterial in nature and a specific species of bacteria, you really need to get into the LLT level. So yes, I agree. Most people do their analysis at the SOC and PT level. And that may be a good way of doing a first blush to understand if you have major issues. But if you really get into one of those Friday afternoon situations where your drug is in jeopardy and you really need to know everything that's going on, there's no way around going in and looking at the associated LLT that was selected for a particular case to really understand why it fell under that PT or medical concept. Other questions?
Wonderful. Our next question, I'm not sure if this might have to be escalated to one of our IT colleagues. It asks, can we integrate this Smq analysis as part of a third-party coding tool via API?
I cannot answer that question for you. I can simply tell you that the basis for this Smq analysis tool is that we had to do something to accommodate MedDRA users who were not part of huge organizations that had a multi-million-dollar data management platform available to them that may have had SMQs already embedded in it. So they had the ability to use their existing system to incorporate or do analysis with SMQs. We developed the Smq analysis tool for smaller organizations or individuals who don't have that ability. They're still working at a laptop and needing to create spreadsheets, and maybe they're doing their own ad hoc analysis within a large organization, but want to do it at their desktop. They have the Smq analysis tool to be able to do that. The ability to integrate that into your existing system, we can escalate that to the IT folks. One of my concerns with that would be anytime you roll a tool into your own database, or excuse me, your own platform, you have to worry about how well the two things play with each other, how compatible they are. So let's see what the IT folks say, but I would be very cautious about that type of strategy, because you do not want your established platform to not work well just because you've rolled something into it that was not meant to be rolled into it. So if you can just take that person's name, Hannah, and we can kick that to the IT folks and see what response they have as well.
Absolutely.
Other questions?
Our next one is if you could please remind where the case ID comes from.
So the case ID is just something that I arbitrarily assigned in that particular case. So I'm going to show you that I just decided that I was going to give each one of these patients a number. So I called patient number 1, 2, 3, 4. That's something I assigned. I don't have to have a case ID in a spreadsheet like this. However, if I'm going to do an algorithmic search, it's in my best interest to have a case ID. Otherwise, I won't know when the events that I'm seeing are specific to a particular patient. And I do need to know that, because when I am using an algorithmic SMQ, I need to know not when did it occur or what occurred, but I need to know who it occurred in. I don't care about concepts that are spread across 3 patients. I care about that one patient having 3 different concepts that were potentially lupus related. Other questions?
How did you collect your data?
That's a very general question. How did I collect my data? I used the coding conventions of my organization, and I had rules for how I wanted to code. So if you're asking me, how do you code? My suggestion would be that if you have not already, that you consider attending one or more of the coding webinars, the basic coding or advanced coding, or maybe a face-to-face course when we are able to get back in the mode of doing those. But most people work within organizations that have coding conventions that tell them how they should code. And if they don't have their own coding conventions, we produce and distribute a points to consider document for term selection that help you to decide. How you code within your organization is up to your organization. Whether you code signs and symptoms, diagnoses, whether you code past medical history, procedures, social circumstances, that is up to you to decide how you're going to code. I would simply say if you don't encode what would in retrospect turn out to be important information, when it comes time for analysis, if you haven't coded it, it's not possible for you to do analysis of it. Other questions?
Our last question at the moment is, can you highlight what is the importance of weight?
So this one particular SMQ, and it's the only SMQ that is a weighted algorithm, really stems from the fact that if you were to ask a group of rheumatologists, what does a typical case of lupus look like, you could not get an answer. It's a disorder that looks very different in every single patient. So if I were sitting in the emergency room on a Saturday, the first lupus patient that came in may have a butterfly rash on her face. The next patient may come in having seizures because they have seizures as a manifestation. The next patient that comes in may be in heart failure because they have a pericardial effusion. The next patient that comes in may have kidney failure. So what ended up in developing this SMQ is that we had our experts get together, look at the possible signs and symptoms that could be associated with lupus, and give it some weight based upon the likelihood or its specificity of being specific for lupus, as well as having a significant impact on the overall health of the patient. So there's nothing magical except to say that the weights range from 1 to 3. They are subjective and sometimes backed up by literature, but the whole point is we created a threshold that once a patient has enough things going on that the weighted average is 7 or more, that's the case you probably should look at. Nothing magical about it. This SMQ's been out for a long, long time. We've never had any pushback that the threshold of 7 that was selected is incorrect. And again, it's a very specific topic, and it is the only weighted algorithmic SMQ. Other questions?
We've had one last question come in. It asks, safety teams assign multiple codes to one particular term. However, this is not possible in clinical database. Will this affect case retrieval?
Absolutely. And again, that's the problem that you have when you're limited in how many terms you can select. I can't really fix that problem for you. We sometimes will look at a report and decide that multiple LLTs should be coded from a report. And if you don't have the ability to do that, you internally need to make a decision about what you think to be the most important concept and database that. That's a limitation that I just cannot help you with or address. It sometimes is based on product, it sometimes is based on region, it sometimes is based upon regulatory considerations. All I can simply say is in an ideal world where you're able to collect as much information as you would like, it certainly helps when it comes time to analyze the data. I grew up in a drug environment, originally working in a pharmaceutical company where we were told to code everything. Because the point is that 2 years down the line in our clinical trial project, if we didn't ask about something 2 years ago and we don't have that data in a database, then we can't analyze it. So we captured much more than perhaps we could have or should have, but it's better to have more data than to not have data. If you have inherent limitations in what you can capture, all I can say is use your best judgment as to what are the most important concepts for you to be coding in your database. Any last minute questions?
We've had nothing else come in.
All right, well, I would like to thank you for your time and participation in today's very limited tool demonstration on the Smq Analysis Tool. If you've not been using SMQs, I would suggest that you might find utility in using them. And if you want to use the SMQ Analysis Tool available, here's another way for you at your desktop to be able to do some analyses to get some idea of potential issues that you may not have been aware of with your particular product. So I'm going to thank Hannah for her help and assistance today. Thank you for your time and participation. And if nothing else has come in at the 11th hour, this is Dr. David Richardson. I do want to just do one last thing that I promised to do when I started, which is just to show you a few of these things. Here's this SMQ spreadsheet that I mentioned to you. And I want you to see that just like the tool for SMQ analysis, it has the ability for you to open up hierarchical SMQs to multiple levels and be able to see them. It has a number of tabs on it where you can look at things such as the active counts of PTs within a particular SMQ, whether they're active or inactive or not. The second thing that I want to point out is this version report, where I told you you could look at the SMQ changes. So if I were to scroll across here until eventually I came to the SMQ changes in this particular version report, click on that page, I could then see that in this report, the major change between the two versions was that we added an SMQ. And so this was version 25.0 being compared to version 24.1, where we added the new SMQ, non-infectious myocarditis, pericarditis. And the last thing that I just wanted to show you is the SMQ Intro guide. And let's see if I can pull that up easily, because that is the encyclopedic area that you go to where you are going to be able to find all things related to a particular SMQ. I'm going to find this the easiest way that I can, which will be just to go back and, hold on one second, I'm going to open up the go to the MedDRA website, and if I click here and ask for support documentation, it's going to take me to support documents, one of which is this document, which I said is 309 pages long and contains information on every single one of the available SMQs. All right. So nothing has come in, Hannah, so I'm going to sign off then, and thank you for your time and participation in today's webinar.
Thank you, Dave. I will close the session.
All right.